Good morning, everybody. So glad that you could join us for another Wednesday webinar, which is proudly sponsored by the Dairy Standard Agency. I'm Jacqueline Oendal from the DSA, and Jandri Klopper from Plaas Media will facilitate the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So special thanks to Plaas Media for their marketing and technical support. We have a really hot topic today. New FMD regulations unpacked in plain English. And the well-known expert that will unpack it for us is Dr. Mark Chimes, who was appointed to the Ministerial Task Team on controlled animal disease and was closely involved in the drafting of the new regulations. So Dr. Mark will discuss the new Section 9, the control measures relating to outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, highlighting those that affect the dairy industry. So ample opportunity will be given to answer any questions on the interpretation and applications of the new regulations. So you are more than welcome to write in the question bar, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A session to ask your question directly to Dr. Mark. I just want to mention that Jandri will then allow you to speak, but you still have to unmute yourself on your electronic device. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Mark. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Jacqueline, and good morning, everybody. As you know, the new Section 9 regulations were published earlier this month, so they're now in force. But before I start, I just need to do the disclaimer that I'm not a legal expert, and therefore my interpretation might be wrong in some instances. But in the event of any discrepancy between these notes and the official text, the official documentation shall prevail, just in case I say something completely wrong. I'm only going to discuss the most important changes in the regulations that really affect the dairy farmers directly and the dairy processors. So you'll notice that my slides are very text heavy. The reason is so that you can go back to this webinar and you can fast forward through it to just read the parts that you want to, and you don't have to listen to me droning on about everything after this webinar is posted on the website. So what you need to know is that the previous regulations were drafted when we were South Africa was foot and mouth disease free. And as a result, at that stage, the regulations were very, very strict because we wanted to keep the country free. Unfortunately, systems failed, and we've now got foot and mouth disease throughout the country. And we were necessitated to take into account the current situation and allow farmers to trade while limiting the risk of spreading foot and mouth disease. We realized that the old regulations were so strict that there was a possibility that we would end up with no farmers in the end if we continued with those regulations. And that's why we had to write regulations that actually suited the current situation. Now, this was done under a lot of pressure, so there is a possibility that some amendments would still need to be made to correct some mistakes or instructions that are unclear. And at the end of the regulations, there's a little sentence that says that this document must be reviewed within 12 months from the date of publication. So it's a living document that will be adapted as the feasibility and the effects of all these measures become known. There might be some unintended consequences that we haven't thought of. My slides not moving. There we are. Now, Minister Oukamp was appointed earlier this month as well, the new Minister of Agriculture. He got out of the blocks really, really quickly, and he made some announcements as well. And the first one is that almost the poor biological products have given up their right to be the sole importer of foot and mouth disease vaccines, which now means that any other supplier of vaccines that is legally registered can now import the vaccines as well, and this will hopefully alleviate the sort of bottleneck that we've been having with vaccines for the past, well, more than a year, or for this year, to be honest. Now, what he also announced is that the owners of cloven-hooved animals may register to vaccinate their animals against foot and mouth disease, even if they don't have foot and mouth disease. Under the old regulations, what they used to do was, if a farm became infected, then the state vet would go out and he would vaccinate that farm and all the surrounding farms, and we were just chasing the disease rather than getting ahead of it. And but for a farmer to register, he needs to go onto the government website, and he needs to comply with certain conditions, where he must have a fenced farm, he must be able to prove that he's got biosecurity, that these animals are registered on a traceability system, and that he can report back as he needs to whenever he vaccinates the farms. What he also announced, the minister, is that a farmer may now vaccinate his own animals. Under the previous regulations, it was that the vaccinations had to be administered by the state vet, the animal health technician, or under the supervision of a private veterinarian that is authorized by the state. What the minister now did is he gave authorization under the law that all farmers are now authorized to, or can become authorized, put it that way, if they apply for authorization, and then they can vaccinate their own animals without supervision. But there are conditions, such as the cold chain must be preserved, and be very careful that you don't get into a false sense of security because you're vaccinated. You must still apply biosecurity measures despite vaccination. Now, a farmer wanting to vaccinate his own animals must apply to the National Director of Animal Health. And I've put the website address in there where you can go and register, and we'll get to this a bit later. I'll also be listing it at the end of this talk again so that you can copy it down. Now, so if you want to vaccinate your own animals, you must inform the state vet or the provincial director that you want to vaccinate your animals at least 5 days before you want to vaccinate them, and with which vaccine you would prefer to use. And then once you've vaccinated your animals, you've got 14 days within which you need to fill in your report and send in all the documents. And that includes what vaccine you used, all the tag numbers of the animals that were vaccinated, how the cold chain was kept, who did the vaccination, how it was administered, etc. If you do not send in these reports, then your authorization will be withdrawn. You will not be able to get more vaccine for your booster vaccinations, etc., until the paperwork is done. Now, this is the website that you can go to. This is the government website, and you'll see at the top here, it says FMD NDA Government ZA. The easiest way to remember is obviously foot and mouth disease dot the National Department of Agriculture of the Government of South Africa. So it's a fairly easy website to remember. Now, if you go onto that web page and you go to and then you click here to register, and it'll take you to this page, and then you fill in this form. Make sure that all the supporting documents are ready, that you submit photos or scan and email them or whatever. And if all the documentation and all your details are correct, and you press enter, then you will be automatically registered and will immediately get an email to say that you are authorized, provided the government is satisfied that you can comply with the conditions to be able to vaccinate yourself. Not all farmers will automatically comply with that. So what do the regulations say, the new Section 9 regulations? It says that an owner who suspects, remember, see this, it's if you suspect that you've got foot and mouth disease, then you must immediately report it, and you must immediately enforce biosecurity on your farm. So in other words, isolate the herd that's affected, keep them away from other animals, prevent the movement of animals or any animal products. So that includes things like animals going for slaughter, milk, any animal dung that you want to sell as fertilizer, or if you're harvesting for hay, for instance, that must all be contained on the farm. and you must restrict access to your premises. You don't want people coming and going onto your farm, and you must, by law, allow access to the state vet to come and inspect the herd. These are legal requirements, so make sure that you comply with them. Now, if you've got foot and mouth disease, then all the animals must be individually identified. If not, the state vet will tag them all as well. And you must compile a complete register of all the susceptible species where they must be recorded. So if you're keeping a few pigs and a few sheep on your farm as well, they better be tagged. They must have numbers, and you've got to have them on a list. And then you must keep this list updated. So any animals that die or that get born in the meantime or get sent for slaughter or whatever, you've got to update that list all the time so that there's an updated list available on your farm. All your animals must also be registered on the livestock identification and traceability system, on a system. There are several of them about, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. And if your animals are vaccinated, then you must have documented evidence of the vaccination. And you must be able to then prove that their vaccinations are kept up to date, their booster vaccinations, etc. Now, the state vet, I'm not going to go through the whole quarantine process, etc. When the state vet arrives on the farm, he will assess the situation and he will tell you what to do, and he will go through the whole testing and quarantining the property. But what we did change is that we've put timelines on this within which it must happen to prevent the unnecessary delays that we have experienced up till now. And so the property must be verbally placed under quarantine with immediate effect. That's by the state vet. So he hasn't even got to the farm yet, but he'll tell you you're under quarantine until I get there. And then he must follow this up with a written quarantine notice, and he must visit the property within 24 hours, where he will do an epidemiological investigation, and he will then give you guidance on the biosecurity measures that you need to implement. Now, each outbreak's control measures are determined by the conditions on the farm. So what we've done is, instead of having hard and fast rules, we're now giving the state vet some leeway to look at an individual situation and adapt or adjust the control measures as necessary. To give you an example, for instance, under the old regulations, we had a situation just outside Oudtshoorn where there was a farm on the Oudtshoorn side of the Swartberg mountain range that had foot and mouth disease. And on the other side, on the Karoo side, so this is the Oudtshoorn side, is the Klein Karoo, and on the other side in the Karoo was a farm with sheep, which was 9.5 kilometers away as the crow flies. But he was placed under quarantine because the old rule said everybody within a 10-kilometer radius must be placed under quarantine. And the only way you could access that farm is if you took the Swartberg Pass, which is about an hour's drive to get over the mountain to the farm on the other side. The Meyringspoort Road had washed away during the flood, so there was no access from that side in any case. And there was no flexibility for the state vet to say, no, I don't have to put him under quarantine. The law said he had to, and therefore the state vet had to do it. So we're giving the state vet the authority to now make a call in these situations and say, no, look, this virus is not going to fly over the mountain. That farm is quite safe, doesn't have to be under quarantine at all. Now, as once a site is confirmed to be infected, all the cloven-hooved animals on site are considered infected. In other words, pigs, sheep, whatever else you've got that have cloven-hooved, that are all susceptible species, are considered positive until proven otherwise. So no movement of these animals is allowed from a farm that's under quarantine without a Red Cross permit, which must be issued by the state veterinarian. And that applies to animal products as well, as I've mentioned, whether it's milk, meat, hay that's produced on the farm, anything else, even manure that is being sold for fertilization, etc. If you want to sell it, you must get a Red Cross permit from the state vet while you're under quarantine. Once you're not under quarantine, obviously these rules don't apply. Now, the adjacent farm, so if you've got foot and mouth disease, then the farms that border onto your farm will be placed under movement restrictions as well. And this includes what we call epidemiologically linked farms. Now, epidemiologically linked farms, if you've got, say, you've got your farm with your dairy parlor that's become infected, but you also have a heifer farm or a dry cow farm, even if it's 200 kilometers away, it will be placed under movement control. So nothing may move off that farm until such a time as the state vet is satisfied that that epidemiologically linked farm is not infected. Now, on large farms, it's also possible that the state vet will be satisfied that there might be other areas on the farm which are quite safe and are not infected and do not need to remain under quarantine. For instance, if you've got a very large farm and let's say the one half of the farm is under irrigated pastures for your dairy cows, and on the other side of the farm, which might be across a valley or even the other side of the river or behind a kopje or a mountain where you keep your beef cattle or sheep or whatever, but they're completely separated. And if the state vet is satisfied that these units are completely separated, he might then only quarantine the infected herd and say the rest of the farm does not have to be under quarantine as well, and he will lift, he's allowed to then lift quarantine on that portion of the farm. But this will be judged on a case-by-case basis. This is not a rule that's just applied across the board. Now, once you've been placed under quarantine and you've got an infected herd, now you want to determine when your day zero is. Now, day zero is when the state vet is satisfied that there are no new cases occurring on the farm. So there's no more, say, circulating virus leading to further infections. Now, what will happen is once you notice that there's no more new cases happening on your farm, you phone the state vet, and that state vet must then come to inspect the herd within 5 days. And he'll inspect the herd, and let's say he sees there are no fresh cases on the farm. There's some cows with old lesions. You can tell very clearly that they're old and not new cases. So he's happy there's no new cases happening on the farm, and he notes down that date. Then 2 weeks later, he needs to come back to the farm and inspect the animals again. And if there were no new cases within that 2-week period, he will then say that day zero was the date of the first inspection. In other words, 14 days earlier. Now, it is also possible that, let's say you've got a dairy farm with a beef farm next door, and the guy farms, say, Ngunis. And Ngunis don't generally show symptoms of foot and mouth disease that severely. So he got foot and mouth disease. He didn't even realize. He's not the best farmer. He didn't even realize he had foot and mouth disease. So his herd has recovered from it, totally unaware he's had the problem. And now suddenly your dairy starts showing symptoms. The state vet comes out, checks your dairy, says, yeah, it's foot and mouth disease, puts you under quarantine, puts the neighboring farm under movement control, goes to the neighboring farm the next day, inspects the animals, see there's old lesions or whatever, takes blood to make sure that they haven't been infected, and then the blood results come back and it says, no, but he's got foot and mouth disease, or he had it because there's antibodies. These herds not been vaccinated yet. In that case, the state vet will say, well, we're going to have to vaccinate that herd as well. And when he vaccinates them, the day zero will be determined then as the day that the last animal on that farm was vaccinated for the first time. That will be that farmer's day zero, because there's no more circulating virus on his farm, which is proven by that there were no new cases by the time the state vet arrived. So he was infected. He will be placed under quarantine, same as you, but his day zero will start from that date when the last animal was vaccinated on the farm, whereas your day zero will be determined as that 2 inspections 2 weeks apart that the state vet did. Now, quarantine will then be lifted 42 days after day 0 if there are no animals that have shown any fresh symptoms of foot and mouth disease during that period. So at 42 days after day 0, the state vet comes out again, inspects your herd, sees there were no new infections on the farm, and he's quite happy. And he says, okay, dates, now we can lift quarantine. And then he must submit that application to lift the quarantine within 24 hours. And if this application is successful, then he must give you a written quarantine cancellation notice, which must be issued within 24 hours once he's got report back. So basically, the person responsible for the animals must be informed of the outcome of the application. So from when he submits his application, the provincial head of animal disease or national director, if that's the case, they must process that application within 48 hours of it being submitted. And if they don't, and if you don't get your reports back within the times, you are then allowed to escalate it up to the provincial director or even to the national director. And if you're still not getting any joy, go to the Minister of Agriculture. So they have to now stick to these timelines so that we can. In the past, it has happened that it takes forever for the state vet to get out to the farm, and then it takes forever to get the results and lift the quarantine, and farmers remained under quarantine unnecessarily long when it wasn't really required. Now, for milk producers, this is the part most of you are interested in, is how does it affect you as a dairy farmer? First of all, if your herd is not infected and you vaccinate them against foot and mouth disease, you are not placed under any restrictions whatsoever. It's like vaccinating your cattle against lumpy skin disease or one of the clostridial diseases or whatever. So the old rule of quarantining vaccinated farms does not apply. You may not sell, if you are under quarantine, you may not sell unpasteurized milk directly to the public. You may still sell milk, but only if you pasteurize it on the farm. And generally, most municipalities in the country don't allow farms to sell fresh, unpasteurized milk in any case. So it only applies in very few instances. The other thing is also, under the old rules, your milk, if you're under quarantine, had to be collected separately and kept separate from the other farms that weren't under quarantine. And that rule no longer applies. So the thing where the lorry had to come out and then only pick up your milk and take it back to the processor, that no longer applies. So the lorry can now go to all the other farms, pick up the milk, and then come to your farm last and pick up your milk in the same lorry and take it in. So this will save tremendous amounts of transport cost that farmers suffered in the past, where milk was being shipped all over the show, or you had to pay for a lorry to come out just to pick up your milk and nobody else's. And as I've mentioned before, you must be wary of other products on the farm, specifically cow manure. You must assume that it's infected, and you must compost it in an appropriate manner to prevent the spread of foot and mouth disease. And the same also applies to feed and pasture, especially if you're selling hay or whatever. Assume that it's infected. There is a suspicion, I think in the Western Cape, that foot and mouth disease was brought into the garden route by feed being bought in the Free State and in the Northwest Province, which are both fraught with a foot and mouth disease. And there's a suspicion that that might have caused some of the cases that happened in the Western Cape. So be very wary when you buy feed that it's either properly treated or stored long enough for the virus to die before given to your animals. Now, the milk buyers, if they're supplying to the domestic market, okay, first of all, any milk coming from a quarantined farm must be recorded. And they must keep records of the farm of origin, the farm's infection status, how the milk was processed, etc., which are things they generally do anyway. They must still apply strict biosecurity when collecting the milk. So they must make sure that these trucks are cleaned and disinfected. Ideally, if they're collecting from a lot of unquarantined farms, then they should stop at the quarantine farm last, so that the lorry from there goes straight back to the factory where it can be unloaded and then cleaned and disinfected, etc. So the standard biosecurity still applies. You must remember, vaccination doesn't prevent your herd from getting foot and mouth disease. It prevents the virus from spreading as easily, and it certainly reduces the severity of the disease if you get it in your herd. But do not become complacent just because you're vaccinated. Maintain your biosecurity. If the milk is destined only for the domestic market, so they're not exporting the milk, they only need to single pasteurize it. There's no more need for double pasteurization and only treating it as UHT milk before it's allowed to be released or sold on the market. Now, unfortunately, if your milk buyer is supplying to the export market, they might still be placed under some restrictions by the importing country. Remember, the importing country makes the rules of what dairy products they're willing to accept and how it needs to be treated. So, you know, they pay the piper, so they call the tune. So if you're a milk processor and you export, then you must, and you're going to receive milk from quarantine farms, you must first apply to the state veterinarian so that they can then check that you can keep this milk separate from the others, or that you can comply with the rules and regulations of the importing country. Now, the milk that's delivered to the milk processor does not have to be kept, the raw milk does not have to be kept separate, the foot and mouth disease milk and the unquarantined milk. Not necessary to keep it separate, unless the importing country insists that that's the case. We're not looking at the status of the milk coming into the factory. We're focusing now on how the milk is processed and how safe is the milk leaving the factory, because that's where the danger lies. Not when it comes to the factory, it's when it leaves the factory. So there must be auditable evidence as well that during the milk processing that they can keep the unprocessed milk and the processed milk separate. So where the milk is delivered to the factory, that milk must be kept separate to the cartons and bottles of milk and yogurt and whatever else on the other side of the factory, so that these two cannot mix at all, so that you can't contaminate the product by mistake. Now, milk destined for the export market must still be processed according to WOA standards, which is originally was double pasteurization or UHT treated milk. What we have managed is we've also made in the new regulations accepted the rule of equivalence, which means if the process that you use on your dairy product is equal to or exceeds the standards of the WOA standards, then the South African authorities will accept that that milk is of export standard. Remember, it's still the prerogative of the importing country to decide whether they are willing to accept these standards or not. So you need to clarify it with them. But for instance, to give an example, under the old rules, if you made condensed milk, you had to double pasteurize the milk first or put it through the UH process before you could make condensed milk. What we're saying now is, well, if you're using pasteurized milk and you put it through the condensed milk making process, which uses a temperature that's higher than pasteurization for a time period that's higher than or longer than pasteurization, then that exceeds the second pasteurization standards. So therefore, you can export condensed milk now. It's similar things with making, say, dairy snacks or whatever, where or cheese, and you had to double pasteurize it or UHT treat it beforehand. That's not necessarily required anymore if the secondary process, especially with some of the dairy snacks, where it's reheated again to a higher temperature and for longer periods than a second pasteurization would have been. Now, the slaughter of animals, no slaughter of a quarantine animal is allowed before the 16th day after day 0. So if you've got foot and mouth disease, your farm's going to be put under quarantine. You've got to wait until the disease is no longer spreading on your farm. The state vet comes out, he inspects them, says, yeah, it's the case. Comes back 2 weeks later, he says, yes, it's the case. And he determines day 0. Now, remember, I said day 0 is the date of the first inspection. So if your first inspection was, say, on the 1st of June, and the state vet comes back on the 14th of June and says, yes, you're clear, 2 weeks later, right? Day 0 is determined as the 1st of June. So on the 16th of June, you can start slaughtering animals, but only at an FMD approved abattoir. These animals may only go to the abattoir under a Red Cross permit, remember, because you're still under quarantine. And you must get written consent in advance from the abattoir to confirm that they are willing to receive animals that are under quarantine. An export facility, for instance, may still slaughter animals from foot and mouth disease farms, but they need to satisfy the importing country that they can keep the foot and mouth disease quarantine animals, those lines, separate from the non-quarantined animals that are being slaughtered. Also, animals must be clinically healthy, so you can't send sick animals to the abattoir. There should be certainly no signs of new foot and mouth disease cases in the herd after day 0. When these animals, while you're under quarantine, from day 0 until day 41, from day 16 to day 41, after day 0, only the head and feet need to be destroyed, not even the tongue, just the head and feet. This old rule where the 5th quarter had to be disposed and everything no longer applies. And then from day 42 onwards, animals may be slaughtered at any abattoir without any restrictions. Basically, your quarantine is now being lifted. Once you've got your quarantine certificate, your quarantine is lifted, you can now slaughter at any abattoir again as per normal, and nothing has to be destroyed. No parts of the carcass need to be destroyed at all. Another thing we brought in to make life a bit easier is that under certain circumstances, live animals may be moved from a quarantine premises. Once again, the state veterinarian will determine the necessity of moving these animals on a case-by-case basis. And once again, only under a Red Cross permit, so the state vet must be moved because you're involved because you are still under quarantine. And obviously all these animals which are moved must be recorded in a livestock identification and traceability system so that we know where these animals are. Basically why we brought in this rule is it's for farms that have heifer or dry cow farms, and they've got a dairy parlor which are separate, and these animals are starting to calve. Now they need to be moved from the dry cow or the heifer farm to the main farm. Assuming, let's say your dairy parlor farm has got foot and mouth disease, so they're under quarantine, and now your heifer farm got foot and mouth disease as well, so they're under quarantine as well. So they are of the same status. Then the state vet will say, well, yeah, you can move them from your heifer farm to your parlor, but the farm where they were moved from will still be under quarantine, but at least you're allowed to move the animals. But basically what it comes down to is, under these circumstances, consult your state vet, and they will decide on a case-by-case basis what can be done. Now, it says also here, that last point, that livestock from farms that are not known to be infected, but are under movement control. In other words, let's say you've got foot and mouth disease, your neighbors are all under movement control, but they're not showing any symptoms, and there's no evidence to prove that they've got foot and mouth disease. Those animals can be allowed to move to the abattoir under a Red Cross permit. So we don't want to impose the very strict quarantine regulations on the neighboring farms unnecessarily. He cannot sell animals to another farm, but he can send them to the abattoir where we feel it's sort of a dead end, if I may. Now, there are special circumstances within the regulations that are tabulated. I've just put an example on here, specifically cows or heifers before or after calving, and the possible reason for that is there's no feeding, watering systems or place to milk these animals at all. Obviously, in natural disaster cases where, let's say, you've had a veld fire and there's no food for the animals on the farm, if you've got another farm of similar status where they're both under quarantine or whatever, the state vet might allow you to move those animals to a different farm as well. And obviously, if you have other species, especially game on the farm that you can't move, Once again, the state vet will consider it on a case-by-case basis. Something else they're allowing is a depopulation of the farm. It becomes a bit complicated and confusing sometimes to interpret these regulations. But basically, if you've got a heifer farm and you move all the heifers off your heifer farm to your dairy parlour farm, then you may repopulate that heifer farm on day 0 with vaccinated animals. So let's say you get foot and mouth disease on both your farms, and they've now determined when day 0 is, and you move all your heifers to your main farm. When your main farm, when that day 0 is reached, that same day 0 will now apply to your heifer farm, and you can then go and repopulate it with vaccinated animals on day 0. You may also repopulate it with unvaccinated animals on day 0 if you can prove that those animals that you're using to put onto that, to repopulate the farm, has been in quarantine, or basically in isolation, for at least 28 days prior to being put onto that farm. So we feel that by day 0, there's no more circulating virus on the farm, and you must just prove that the animals coming in also don't have any circulating virus. Also, if these animals are vaccinated that you're putting on that farm, they must have been vaccinated at least 2 weeks before they move to that farm, and it must be no longer than 6 months since they've had a vaccination before they move to that farm. So it's in that window period where we know that they still have immunity. Before 14 days from vaccination, the immunity hasn't developed properly yet. And after 6 months, they should have had a booster by then. So if they've not had a booster and it's been more than 6 months since their last vaccination, you can't move them onto the farm. So just for your information, what I've said in this actual webinar is also available in Afrikaans and in English. It's documentation that you probably received it from the MPO as well. And it will be placed on the websites of the Dairy Standard Agency as well as the MPO. So you can always go in on their websites and download these documents and read it as well. Basically, this webinar is a summary of what we've put in there. And then your sources, as I said, the first thing is if you want to register or become authorized to vaccinate your own animals, if you go to this website, foot and mouth disease, at the National Department of Agriculture of the Government of South Africa. That's how you remember it. And you go there, you register to be authorized to vaccinate. And once you have your authorization, you can then place your order for your vaccines, and it will all be processed from there. Your other website where the documents and the webinar will hopefully be available is on the MPO's website, as well as at the Dairy Standard website. And that hopefully leaves enough time for some questions, because I'm sure there's still a lot of unanswered confusion regarding these regulations. Thank you.
Indrek du Plessis, you can ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Chimes. Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. Firstly, are these regulations only going forward, or is it also retrospectively? So if you have a farmer who is not infected but was put under quarantine 3 months ago and he still has 9 months to go on the old regulations, does his day 0 now change? And does it become 42 days? And secondly, when it comes to Namibian exports, the 10-kilometer radius rule still applies. But if farms are not automatically put under quarantine now, if they are within 10 kilometers, how then would we know whether a farm is within 10 kilometers of an FMD farm?
Yeah, the first part is, yes, these new rules apply to all the farms. Even those that have been under quarantine for longer than 42 days can now get their day 0 determined. So you just have to be a bit patient. I know we've got these timelines where the state vet has to inspect your farm within 24 hours and answer within 48 hours, etc. But there's probably about 1,500 farms that are now coming out of quarantine simultaneously. So you can imagine how inundated the state vets are. But in some areas, they've been very, very active to lift quarantine on these farms that have been under quarantine for more than 42 days since day zero. So yes, those farms can come out. In terms of Namibia, yes, we are gradually running out of farms that are further than 10 kilometers away from an infected farm. Namibia is a special case because they obviously state that an export facility may not receive any milk from a foot and mouth disease infected farm if it is within 10 kilometers of any farm that was placed under restrictions. This is where the state vet comes in and needs to determine whether the milk that's being supplied is indeed further than 10 kilometers away from any farm that's been placed under quarantine. It's a difficult one, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't always know how you're going to know this, because unfortunately the state vets apply the POPI Act very strictly. So if you have foot and mouth disease, they will not notify anybody that you have foot and mouth disease, because under the POPI Act they may not do it. However, they must go and inspect the farms next door, so it becomes pretty apparent very quickly as to who's got foot and mouth disease. And so as a result, the milk buyers will generally know who's got foot and mouth disease, and it's also in the farmer's contract normally that they have to notify their milk buyer of anything that might affect the quality or the safety of the milk. So they have to notify their milk buyer if they're under quarantine. The milk buyer will then be able to look on Google Maps whether any other farms are within 10 kilometers, and will then be able to verify that with the state vet, who will then be able to sign the export certificate for Namibia. But it is a complex process, I agree.
MPO KwaZulu-Natal, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Hi, Mark. Debbie here from the MPO in KZN. I had understood that private vet can now do the inspection, the day zero inspection on farms. Is that not correct?
Debbie, I'll tell you, I'm not 100% sure on that one. We certainly were negotiating with the state veterinary services to authorize veterinarians for certain functions, but determining day zero at this stage, as far as I know, is still a state veterinary responsibility. So unless they're inundated and they specifically authorize a private veterinarian to assist them, I don't think that is the case generally. No, not as a rule.
Thank you.
Ibarfore, you can ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Mark. I just want to ask, on the new regulations, I had a discussion with the state vet. I'm under quarantine at the moment, and there's no mentioning of the lifting of the quarantine. Like you just said, it's 42 days after your day zero, and I'm almost at 150 days. And so they still on the old regulations here. How can I go about to get them to lift the quarantine? Because I'm still under quarantine, and nowhere on the new regulations is stipulated 42 days.
I would escalate it to the provincial director, and if you get no joy there, escalate it to the national director of animal health. I know that mail is slow to get to Limpopo, but but as far as I know, the new regulations were promulgated, I think it was the 8th of July. So as from that date, those are the new rules. So that's how it needs to be applied.
Jessica, you can ask your question.
Hi there. I feel like I'm going to ask a very silly question, but could you please explain the relaxing of the regulations around the mixing of non-quarantined and quarantined milk in the trucks, and also the relaxing at the processing plants?
No, there's certainly no such thing as a silly question. I know these regulations can be quite confusing to interpret. What it basically comes down to is that the main concern is the finished product. Is the finished product that's being sold on the shop shelf or that's going for export, is that safe? In other words, what's the likelihood that that will spread foot and mouth disease? So it's not the safety of the product coming into the factory, it's how safe is it when it leaves. So what we've said is that in the past, if you were under quarantine, the milk buyer had to send a truck separate to collect your milk, and he had to keep that milk separate from all the other farms that are not under quarantine, from their milk. That no longer applies. So they can put all the milk in one truck. And the same with when the truck gets to the milk buyer, to the processor. At the factory, they would normally take all the trucks and they would put them all into one big silo of milk. Now, in the past, if you had foot and mouth disease, that milk had to go into a separate silo, a separate tank. The milk wasn't allowed to be mixed before it's processed. And we said, no, it doesn't matter. You can mix all the milk at the milk processor as well. You do not have to keep the trucks separate or the tanks separate or anything. We're looking at the final product. Once you've processed it, what is the likelihood that the virus will spread in the final product? And that, in a nutshell, is how it works. So you can pick up milk and mix it as much as you like, except if you're an exporter of dairy and the importing country, like Namibia specifically states, that you may not mix milk from quarantine farms and unquarantined farms. They will not accept any product from milk that's been mixed or that's been picked up by the same lorry at the same time. And they go even further and say they will not even accept any milk from any farm that is within 10 kilometers of a quarantine farm. So that's the extreme example.
Yeah.
Another thing that we've also changed, which I didn't mention, was that if a country is willing to accept a standard of milk that does not necessarily comply with WOA, let's say, for instance, Zimbabwe says, oh, we're happy to accept single pasteurized milk. It doesn't have to be pasteurized. The South African authorities will no longer ban the export of that product. Because in the past, what happened was Zimbabwe might say, oh, we're happy to accept it. And then the South African state vet said, no, but this milk does not comply with export standards, therefore it cannot be exported. The rules have now changed. It now says if the importing country is happy, then the South African state vet should not prevent it from happening.
I see. So just back to the kind of scientific premise for mixing the milk, is that because most of the milk these days leaves the farm in a pasteurized state?
No, it leaves it in a raw state, but it's in a sealed lorry. It's not going to... What are the chances of the virus escaping from the lorry and infecting animals? It's very, very remote. So what we've done is we're not going for zero risk. There's probably no such thing as zero risk. We're going for a managed risk or minimal risk. So we're saying that the milk is not going to, unless the lorry leaves the tap open and pours out milk all the way from the farm to the factory, it's actually quite safe. And the same there at the factory, it's pumped straight into a silo, into a tank. So once again, there's no real danger of environmental contamination there. And then once it's processed, it's safe. So that's the sort of the thinking behind it.
Yeah. And in terms, because I'm just thinking now, would foot and mouth milk not have like a higher somatic count than non-foot and mouth milk? So from a public health perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, the quality of the milk is a different thing. So in other words, a cow that's got terrible foot and mouth disease and you know, they've got the severe mastitis, that milk still needs to be discarded on the farm. That cannot go into the tank because the milk buyer will not buy it.
Reject it. Okay.
Yeah, so maybe I didn't make that clear. The milk buyer will still determine the quality of milk that he's willing to accept.
Right.
Or set the standards for that. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and also while we're on that subject, don't give that milk to pigs or to your calves either. They will get foot and mouth disease.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Katie, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Morning, Dr. Chimes. Thank you for the webinar. It's Karen Trendler. Two questions. One is really just a point of clarification because there doesn't seem to be some certainty. Is with the actual administration, the injection of the vaccination, must that be done by a vet or paravet registered person, an AHT or a veterinarian, or can it actually be done by the farmer as long as he complies with all of the other requirements?
Yes, if the farmer applies on this government website, the one I've mentioned here, for authorization to vaccinate himself, and if he receives that authorization, which means he complies with all the standards and paperwork that they want, then he can physically inject the animals himself, and there needs to be no vet or state vet or animal health technician supervising him while he's doing it. And then he has to make sure he fills in his paperwork and submits it on the website within 14 days after vaccinating the animals. So yeah, once you've got your authorization, you can do it yourself.
Thank you. And then the second question, is there any allowance in the new protocol for emergency slaughter for, I know that euthanasia with injectable barbiturates is not practical for large animals under these circumstances, but is there any allowance for emergency slaughter on site for animals that are suffering severely from a welfare perspective?
Yes, up to day 16 post day 0, the animals may not be sent to an abattoir. So in other words, they're under quarantine. During that period, any animals that need to be put down, it needs to be done on the farm, and those animals need to be, that tissue needs to be destroyed on the farm, so it may not leave the farm. And also best to just notify your state vet of any animals that you needed to slaughter on the farm.
So would you apply for permission prior to emergency slaughter, which would obviously delay it, or would you be able to emergency slaughter and then immediately inform the relevant parties?
You can emergency slaughter and notify the state vet afterwards.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the webinar.
Ingrid, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this session, Dr. Chimes. I'm a farmer. I just want to know, you mentioned that farmers need to be able to show documentation for all their booster vaccines. Is there a guideline? What's the latest rules? How often do we need to boost?
Yeah, this is it's not a trick question, but it's a trick answer. Research has shown that giving a booster between 4 and 6 weeks after the first vaccination makes a huge difference in the immunity of the animals. We suspect it might be the reason why there's been breakthrough infections in herds that had been vaccinated once. And if they were given boosters, the chances would have been considerably less. So if your animals have never been vaccinated and they're vaccinated today, then the best advice would be to give a booster 4 to 6 weeks later. And then after that, depending on the type of vaccine, but if it's an oil-based vaccine, your boosters will be done every 6 months. Now, this protocol needs to be adapted depending on the farm as well. If you're using the old Botswana vaccine, which is water-based, that booster needs to be repeated every 3 to 4 months because the immunity doesn't last as long. But certainly, first vaccination, booster vaccination a month later, and after that, every 6 months. That's the basis. But if you are let's say you've got a feedlot where you constantly have animals moving in and out, in that case, you would need to boost much more frequently to make sure that the immunity is kept high. Obviously, all the new animals coming in would need to be vaccinated as well. So in those dynamic populations, the rules change a bit. For instance, your peri-urban cattle, where there's very little movement control and we don't always know which animals are coming and going, there we would give boosters every 3 months. But for the average dairy farmer, vaccinate twice a month apart, and after that, every 6 months.
Thank you. That makes it clear. Thanks so much.
Catherine, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Dr. Mark. Hope you're well. Thank you very much for the seminar. I have a question with regards to the procurement of the vaccines. I know that we've been getting a few from different bordering countries, but I want to know those that are available to the farmers now. What are the guidelines to purchasing them? Because I have clients that come to me and I just revert them back to the website, our agricultural website. But it always seems like a little bit of a hunt in the dark.
I was hoping nobody would ask. It's a very, very confusing. Okay, I've spoken to the RMIS, to the MPO, to all these different guys. None of them have been able to give me an answer. They all say exactly the same. Nobody knows. The first question was, who supplies the vaccine and where does the farmer get his vaccine? Is it the state vet, his private vet? Do they get it directly from DuneVax or Biogenesis or OBP? Unfortunately, the minister made this announcement before we were ready. And the problem is there are several platforms on which you can register to be vaccinated. So whether you're on the RMIS system or the MPO system, what's the other one? Buffalo Analytics. They all have these systems where you can register, and then you can also register on the government website directly for authorization. So no, we don't really know. There is actually today a joint meeting of the Ministerial Task Team and the Industry Coordination Committee. So the ICC, that's made up of the various agricultural associations. And I submitted a question, because obviously I'm on this webinar, so I can't attend the meeting, that they need to ask for the government to give us an authorized central database to which all these systems need to talk. Because currently these systems don't talk to each other very well, and it's a possibility that the farmer's vet made an application for all his farmers on one system, then the farmer goes and registers on another system. Now, do they pick up that it's duplicated? Who gives the vaccine? Does the government pay for it? Must the farmer pay for it? At the moment, it's still very confusing. I would say, by all means, apply through your system, whether it's RMIS, the MPO, Buffalo Analytics, or whoever, or the LITS system, and then let them sort it out and come back to you on that one, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, I can't help you more than that.
No worries. Thank you.
Andre, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, morning, Dr. Mark. Dr. Mark, just a twofold question. In a discussion with one of the farmers in our area recently, is the cold chain of the vaccine is very crucial, for the effectiveness of the vaccine. Firstly, is there proper guidance given to the farmers, being that they are allowed themselves, to vaccinate their animals? And then secondly, is there a way or a practical way, to monitor the cold chain so you don't get a situation where the farm or the vaccine gets to the farm, but somewhere along the line the cold chain is sort of broken? Or what is the parameters, for the vaccine to be sort of out of the cold chain before it loses its effectiveness?
Andre, that standard operating procedure I don't think has been written yet. The task team originally suggested that all vaccines must be supplied through the state vet or the farmer's private veterinarian to ensure the cold chain is kept. At this stage, we don't know how we're going to prove, how a farmer is going to prove or ensure that he maintained the cold chain. It is a very important part, and the only way to do that is obviously by having these automatic temperature loggers, and they're expensive. So are the state vets going to supply, or the private vets supply it to the farmer on loan, until he's vaccinated his cattle, and then he brings it back, and then he logs what the temperatures were? I don't know. We don't have those answers yet. If we kept to the system where it went through private vets or state vets, it would have been easier to at least assure that the cold chain is maintained. But at this stage, it's going to be up to the farmer, and might not always happen as it should, unfortunately.
Yeah, just a comment from myself, because we use these data loggers or temperature loggers in our product as we distribute it through the country. So yeah, then we get those back and we can monitor, the whole cold chain. So maybe that's an option which can be investigated, maybe, to assist the farmers, specifically in an area where they need to get the vaccines to their farms. Just a suggestion on that. Okay.
I think that's a brilliant idea, especially since the authorization, one part of it is that obviously you must be able to prove that you can maintain the cold chain. So that might be worthwhile making this a requirement that they must rent or borrow a temperature logger of some sort to be able to prove that they maintained the cold chain.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dr. Mark.
Thanks, Andre.
It does not look like there's any more questions. All the questions that were left in the chat were already asked by people.
Okay, wonderful.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mark, for once again a really excellent, insightful presentation. We value your input and the huge difference that you make in our dairy industry. So thank you so much. You can see the clapping of hands. We really appreciate you, and thank you for making the time and the effort to bring the new information to us. We really appreciate you. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, Jacqueline. Thank you for the opportunity. And also, if there's any further questions, they can all obviously contact me at mark@milksa.co.za.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I believe that they will do so. Then to conclude, we have our next webinar on the 26th of August, and we'll keep you posted. We'll give you that information. And Dr. Mark has mentioned that the recording will be available on the Dairy Standard Agency's website, but just give us a few days for the editing and then you can find it there. That is all said. So thank you so much for your time, and may you all have a wonderful afternoon. Keep well. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.